Hello, everybody, and welcome to part 4 of a series of introductory talks on Zionism and its victims. So today we're going to cover the period between 1949 and the 1967 June War. And during this time, the Palestinians' post-Nakba identity emerged along with the resistance movement. I'm going to talk for about 35 minutes, and then we'll have some time for discussion, and then some more talk and more discussion. And as well, I'm going to use the term 48 Palestinians to refer to the Palestinians who remained in the modern state of Israel after the Nakba in 1948. Other terms have been used, including Israeli Arabs and Arabs on the inside, but I'm going to use 48 Palestinians to refer to them. By mid-1949, Israel had conquered nearly 80% of historic Palestine and concluded armistice agreements with the neighboring Arab states. Israel didn't want peace treaties, as that would involve creating borders and addressing the refugee problem. Palestine had been wiped from the map and transformed into a state for others. Palestinian society had been destroyed, and the Palestinian people were scattered and fragmented. About 150,000 remained in the new Jewish state. 750,000 were in the West Bank that had been annexed by Jordan. Most of them were refugees. Another 300,000, 200,000 of whom were refugees, were crammed into the Gaza Strip, which was controlled by Egypt. The remaining refugees, about 240,000, were in Lebanon and Syria. Israel had several priorities, all based on its perceived need for security. One, at all costs, refugees must be prevented from returning. Israel's biggest fear was that the refugees would win international support and return. They were Israel's most dangerous enemy. Two, bring in more immigrants to settle the land and prevent the refugees' return. Three, subjugate the 48 Palestinians and prevent any expressions of nationalism. This involved taking as much of their land as possible, continuing to expel them, and imposing severe living conditions. A government official said, quote, "If the Arabs remain hewers of wood, perhaps it will be easier to control them." 4, keep the 48 Palestinians separate from Jews. As a cabinet minister said, quote, "Separation makes it possible to maintain a democratic regime within the Jewish population alone." And 5, gain more international acceptance and legitimacy. Within the new Jewish state, the 150,000 48 Palestinians were mostly in the north, the Galilee, near Nazareth, with 2 other concentrations in central Israel and in the Negev desert. They were defeated, humiliated, terrorized, and leaderless. Most Israelis hated them. To appease world opinion, Israel promised that they would be citizens with full rights. However, the reality was very different, and Palestinians soon felt they were unwanted foreigners in their own land. Israel viewed the 48 Palestinians as a security threat, a potential fifth column, and placed them under harsh military rule that had 4 goals. First, to Judaize or settle as much of the Palestinian land and communities as possible. Second, to reduce the amount of land held by Palestinians. Third, to prevent any resistance or expressions of nationalism. And fourth, to keep the Palestinians isolated in their communities. To avoid criticism, the Israelis created laws to legalize this oppression. They also continued to use the cruel British defense regulations that had been created to suppress the Arab revolt and Zionist terrorists. Previously, the Zionists had criticized these laws, comparing them to Nazi Germany, but now they agreed to use them against the 48 Palestinians. Under these laws, the Palestinians had few rights, and the Israeli army controlled every aspect of their lives. Freedom of movement was strictly monitored, and permits were needed for everything. If someone wanted to leave their village to work, shop, or visit a doctor or a relative, they needed a permit. If a resident wanted to use a telephone in the neighboring village, he had to get a permit. If a goat strayed into a neighboring village, A shepherd might need a permit to retrieve it. People could be arrested and imprisoned for months without charge, and fines and punishments could be imposed without trial. All trials took place in military court. The army could impose curfews and censorship, seize land, uproot whole communities, and deport or transfer Palestinians from one community to another or out of the country. Public collective action, cultural or social, was banned, as were independent Arab political parties. In an effort to de-Palestinize the 48 Palestinians and prevent any expressions of nationalism, Israel divided them into minority subsets and pitted them against each other. All this, even though the terrorized Palestinians didn't pose a threat to anyone. The laws were eventually modified during the late 1950s, but restrictions remained in place until 1966. So this is the Palestinian town of Al-Fahim, and the elders are signing a pledge of allegiance to Israel. Ethnic cleansing continued, and between 1949 and 1950, Israel forcibly displaced about 40,000 Palestinians. During the summer of 1950, Israeli soldiers loaded the 2,000 remaining inhabitants of Al-Mashtal into trucks and dumped them in Gaza. Israel renamed the village Ashkelon and repopulated it with immigrants. In 1951, Israeli troops expelled 7,000 Palestinians from El-Auja. Israel also tried to dispossess the remaining Palestinians of their land. Often the defense ministry declared farmland to be, quote, a closed military zone and forbade the owners from entering. After a while, the Ministry of Agriculture declared that the farmland had been abandoned, seized it, and turned it over to the neighboring Israeli community. As strange as it may seem, 48 Palestinians were allowed to vote. Israel permitted this to placate world opinion, the UN, and international law. However, Arab political parties were outlawed. Palestinians could only belong to and vote for Jewish parties. Of these, the Israeli Communist Party, Maki, was the most committed to democracy and equal rights for 48 Palestinians. In the 1949 elections, 248 Palestinians were elected to the Israeli parliament. As time went on, 48 Palestinians learned to use their status as citizens to contest political power and combat the injustices they were experiencing. However, it was tough, and at times the only way to resist the Israeli colonization was by actively existing. Active existence is resistance. So a couple more slides of Maki posters from the era. While the 48 Palestinians suffered under punitive military rule, hundreds of thousands of refugees languished in hastily constructed camps in Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, the West Bank, and Gaza. Inhabitants of former villages and towns in Palestine often remained together in the camps. So this I showed last week, but it's in Ida refugee camp near Bethlehem. And you can see on the left is the name of all the villages, the 1948 villages that the residents of the camp come from. So they would tend to congregate. Everybody from each of those villages would tend to be together in Ida refugee camp. Conditions were horrific as the camps lacked sanitation and basic health care. Starvation killed thousands. The harsh winter of 1948-49 claimed many lives. At one point in Ramallah, 40 refugees were dying each day from the cold. In early 1949, the New York Times reported of, quote, swarms of children with matchstick arms and legs and protruding bellies produced by progressive starvation, and of babies dying because there was no milk. Feelings of shame, betrayal, disbelief, victimization, despair, and humiliation filled the lives of the refugees, many of whom had been successful farmers and tradespeople. One refugee in Gaza wrote, quote, like many of the men, my father felt an overwhelming anger and frustration. They had been the heads of families, the providers who had status within their own communities. Now they were reduced to handouts from the UN. Many broke down under the strain. One refugee in Syria recalled, quote, we felt subjugated and estranged, dependent on others for everything. We had to turn to others for our bread, which had once been the staple of our meals and was baked daily by our families from the wheat we had grown and harvested. Nostalgia dominated our minds and longing burned in our hearts, but in the end, hunger forced us to continue living. The tragedy of the refugees was compounded by the fact that many of those starving were only a few kilometers away from their farms in Israel. The welcome that the hundreds of thousands of Palestinian refugees experienced in the neighboring countries varied widely. Lebanon, afraid of upsetting the delicate balance of its existing minorities, refused to allow the 130,000 refugees to assimilate. Syria treated the 100,000 refugees who fled there more generously. Almost all the 200,000 refugees in Egyptian territory were confined to crowded refugee camps in the Gaza Strip. Egypt administered Gaza as a part of Palestine, but limited political activity. By 1949, Jordan's population, including the annexed West Bank, was 1.2 million, of whom 66% were of Palestinian heritage. King Abdullah wanted to keep the West Bank, and so his policy combined assimilation and de-Palestinization. He offered Palestinians Jordanian citizenship while ruthlessly suppressing Palestinian nationalists. The term Palestine was banned from official documents. So this is a map from about 1952, and it shows how the West Bank was considered to be part of Jordan. It's important to note that only Britain and Pakistan recognized the annexation of the West Bank. No other countries did, including the Arab countries. And the Arab countries didn't like what Jordan had done, but they eventually rationalized it by saying, well, Jordan is keeping the West Bank in trust until Palestine can be its own state. In July 1951, King Abdullah paid the ultimate price for his collaboration with the Israelis when a Palestinian nationalist assassinated him at the Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem. So here you can see him. This is a year before his assassination, but you can see him at the Al-Aqsa Mosque in East Jerusalem, and the Dome of the Rock is behind the crowd. But it was here that he was assassinated a year later. In the long term, his policies of assimilation succeeded, and hundreds of thousands of Palestinians assimilated into Jordanian society. However, nationalists in the West Bank often saw themselves under a Jordanian occupation. Israel continued to adamantly refuse to allow refugees to return. In a July 1948 letter to the Americans, the government claimed that the refugees had fled voluntarily, and that in the absence of a peace treaty, they would be, quote, a disruptive element in the maintenance of law and order, and a formidable fifth column for external enemies. Left unsaid was Israel's intent to avoid peace treaties, along with its goal of confiscating the refugees' assets. During the second half of 1948, the government enacted laws allowing them to confiscate the refugees' lands, businesses, houses, shops, and bank accounts. Israelis moved quickly, and that autumn they harvested abandoned fields of grain and picked fruit from abandoned orange and olive groves. The enshrining of this massive theft into law was further formalized by the 1950 Law of Absentee Property, which was retroactive. The law defined an, quote, absentee as any Arab who lived in the region under Jewish control on November 29, 1947, the date of partition, but who had left their home after that date and were outside Israel. Under the law, the possessions and properties of these absentees were forfeited to the Jewish state. So, for example, a Palestinian family who had, after November 29th, temporarily left their home in Safed in the Galilee to escape to the safety of Lebanon, about 25 kilometers away, lost everything. They were now homeless, stateless, penniless, and exiled outside Palestine. And it was all quite legal. However, it soon emerged that many of the Palestinians who had been absent from their homes during that time had remained in the future Israeli state. Perhaps a farmer in Safed had gone to buy sheep in the next village. He had indeed been technically absent from his home for a few days, but here he was, an, quote, internal refugee, still in Israel and demanding the return of his property. Undaunted, the Israelis amended the law so that the farmer was now designated a, quote, present absentee and lost his home and his lands. This plundering of Palestinian assets was massive and allowed, as one historian put it, quote, for the wholesale transfer of the entire Palestinian economy to the Israeli state. Practically overnight, the state took control of 300,000 prime agricultural hectares, as well as 73,000 houses and 7,800 shops, warehouses, and businesses, and 6 million British pounds sterling, nearly 3 billion pounds today. More than one Palestinian has described it as, quote, the largest armed heist of the 20th century. This enormous theft dropped the cost of settling a Jewish immigrant family from $8,000 to $1,500, effectively subsidizing the creation of the Israeli state and kickstarting its economy. By 1953, 30% of Israelis were living on land that formerly belonged to Palestinians. Of the 370 new Jewish communities established between 1948 and 1953, 350 were on the land of absentee owners. Israel needed a massive influx of immigrants to populate the land and prevent the return of the refugees. The Israelis hoped that immigration from Europe would continue. However, most European refugees preferred to stay in Europe or immigrate to America, the true promised land. Desperate, the government began persuading and at times coercing Middle Eastern Jews in Iraq, Egypt, Libya, Morocco, Iran, Yemen, and elsewhere to immigrate. Israeli tactics were at times violent. In Iraq, Israeli spies placed a bomb in a Baghdad synagogue and claimed that it was Arab terrorism. Tens of thousands of Arab Jews did immigrate, but they received a cool welcome and endured hardship and discrimination. Ben-Gurion in particular was disappointed, as his dream had always been a Zionist state of European Jews. Of the new arrivals, he said, quote, we are alien to them, and they are alien to us. However, the immigration drive was a success, and between 1948 and 1951, the Jewish population more than doubled to about 1.4 million. To further encourage immigration, in 1950, Israel passed the Law of Return, which gave anyone in the world who had at least one Jewish grandparent the right to immigrate to Israel and immediately become a citizen. This law was a death knell to the hopes of Palestinian refugees, and yet another example of the racially supremacist, apartheid nature of the Jewish state. So I put this slide here to sort of illustrate the apartheid nature of the law of return. This apartheid nature was further highlighted in 1953 when the first, quote, European head of state, Prime Minister D.F. Malan of South Africa, visited Israel. Ben-Gurion praised the architect of apartheid, and eventually the two nations developed close economic and military ties. A core element of the ongoing Nakba in colonization of historic Palestine was Israel's systematic erasure of any trace of Arab history, geography, culture, and religion. The goal was to replace it with a new, fabricated national narrative that reflected Zionist ideology and emphasized the unbroken link, the continuity between the days of the Bible and modern Israel. According to the narrative, Palestine had been a barren desert, a land without a people for a people without a land. The Jews were the natives returning from exile, and they had made the desert bloom, while the Palestinians were transients who were simply, quote, encamped there. Historian Ilan Pape writes that this policy of erasure and replacement was, quote, no less violent than the ethnic cleansing and destruction of historic Palestine. So these are some tourist posters from the era, and you can see they're emphasizing this whole idea of Israel, the land of the Bible. Palestinian writer Ramzi Baroud adds, quote, Israel's blood-stained birth callously required the destruction of an entire nation, people with a unique history, language, culture, and collective memory. It was thus absolutely necessary for the Palestinians to be wiped out to quell any possible sense of Israeli guilt, shame, and legal and moral responsibility for what has fallen millions of dispossessed people. This campaign has been described as memoricide, or the colonizing of memory, or the colonizing of the past, and the de-Arabizing of Palestine. It has been present in Zionist thinking since the introduction of the expression, quote, a country without a people for a people without a country. And since 1948, it has taken several forms. Redrawing and renaming maps, some call it, quote, renaming and reclaiming, became a priority. Palestine disappeared from maps and was replaced with Israel. History books were rewritten, depopulated villages disappeared, and villages, towns, and cities were renamed. Jaffa became Tel Aviv Jaffo, and Lydda became Lod. Prime Minister Ben-Gurion explained the importance of this policy. Quote, we are obliged to remove the Arabic names for reasons of state. Just as we do not recognize the Arabs' political proprietorship of the land, so we do not recognize their spiritual proprietorship in their names. It is important to give these places old Hebrew names, and if they're not available, new names should be given. The Jewish settlements that were built over empty Palestinian villages received new names, and Ein Hod became En Hod. Israeli General Moshe Dayan acknowledged this colonizing of memory. In 1969, while speaking to some students, he observed, quote, we came to this country which was already populated by Arabs, and we're establishing a Hebrew, that is a Jewish state here. Jewish villages were built in the place of Arab villages. You do not even know the names of these Arab villages, and I don't blame you, because these geography books no longer exist. Not only do the books not exist, but the Arab villages are also not there either. There is not a single community in the country that did not have a former Arab population. Memoricide extended into the cultural sphere. Israeli forces seized tens of thousands of Palestinian manuscripts, historical documents, and private libraries. In 1958, they destroyed 27,000 Palestinian books from the 1930s, claiming that they were useless or a threat to the state. This ongoing cultural massacre, as one Palestinian put it, is worse than the European colonizers who, when they stole material, safeguarded it in museums and libraries. Israel also practices ecological colonialism by planting forests of non-indigenous pine trees over the ruins of Palestinian villages and turning them into recreational parks. 86 former Palestinian villages are covered by parks. So this is a poster by the Jewish National Fund, and they are responsible for doing a lot of this planting of forests over villages. And they have also around Jerusalem planted many forests. So this is the British Park, and it's just at the north end of the Negev Desert. And I visited last April. I was part of a political study tour. And so this park is built on 6 depopulated Palestinian villages from 1948. And it's called the British Park or the Britannia Park because it was funded by Zionists in the UK. So this is a short video clip that I took there, just to give you a sense of it. Hope you can hear it okay.
So I'm in the Britannia Park, which is a park funded by the Jewish National Fund. It was built on depopulated villages, Palestinian villages, in the 1948 Nakba. And almost all these trees are not indigenous. They were planted to evoke a feeling of Europe.
Israeli historical scholarship can be characterized as ethnocentric. It often ignores Palestine's Islamic heritage and earlier civilizations and concentrates on the relatively short period of the Hebrew kingdoms. Archaeology has also been weaponized, politicized, and nationalized in order to strengthen Jewish historical claims to the land. Scientific rigor and artifacts from previous civilizations are discarded in a desperate search for evidence of the biblical kingdoms of David and Solomon. So far, they've been unsuccessful. So this is at an archaeological dig in Hebron, the Palestinian city of Hebron in the West Bank. And I visited this in 2014. And they had expropriated the land of a Palestinian family in Tel Rumeida. And they're looking for evidence of Jewish habitation or civilization from past centuries. And they're digging up the land there. They're really just interested in finding artifacts or any evidence that will confirm that there was Jewish civilization there. They're not really interested in anything else. And that's another one. Early on, Israel established separate school systems for 48 Palestinians and Israelis. The state-designed Arab curriculum, quote, de-educated Palestinian students about their own people and history and forced them to view it through Israeli eyes. Anything Arab was mocked or falsified, while everything in the Jewish past was glorified. In Israeli textbooks, Palestinians barely exist. By 2019, 48 Palestinians made up 20% of the population. That year, a study by SIQUI, an Israeli organization, discovered that, quote, in texts for the study of Hebrew, sciences, mathematics, and English, among hundreds of illustrations and photographs, name mentions, and citations from sources, no Arab images or Arab places appear. In only a few instances is Arab society mentioned at all. By 1950, Israeli atrocities during the Nakba had largely faded from the minds of the Western world, which remained supportive of the Jewish state. The Palestinians had, quote, lost their place on the map and become almost invisible except as a humanitarian crisis and refugee problem. This suited Western sensibilities and was less controversial, as it only demanded sympathy, financial donations, and the creation of the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, or UNRWA, to manage the 60-odd refugee camps. The unspoken hope in the West was that the Arab countries would assimilate the refugees. After all, they were all Arabs. Whatever the case, the refugees were increasingly seen as not the West's problem. However, few refugees wanted to assimilate. They wanted to go home. An American reporter observed, "The refugees don't want to be compensated for their lost lands and homes. They don't want to be sent off anywhere. They want to go home to what they consider properly theirs." The Palestinian poet Rashid Hussein voiced the refugees' longings in his poem, Tent Number 50, Song of a Refugee. A few excerpts. Tent number 50 on the left is my new world, shared with me by my memories. Memories as verdant as the eyes of spring. Memories like the eyes of a woman weeping, and memories the color of milk and love. Two doors has my tent, two doors like two wounds. One leads to the other tents, wrinkle-browed like clouds no longer able to weep. And the second, a rent in the ceiling leading to the skies, revealing the stars like refugees scattered, and like them naked. Tent number 50 on the left, that is my present, but it is too cramped to contain a future. And forget, they say, but how can I? Teach the night to forget to bring dreams showing me my village, and teach the wind to forget to carry to me the aroma of apricots in my fields, and teach the sky too to forget to rain. Only then I may forget my country. Ever since their expulsion, refugees have been sneaking into Israel to visit their homes, harvest their crops, and retrieve their possessions. Israel labeled them as, quote, infiltrators, and Ben Gurion said that he viewed, quote, the problem through the barrel of a gun. Soldiers were ordered to shoot to kill. Between 1949 and 1952, soldiers killed about 3,000 unarmed Palestinians who were trying to go home. As time went on, some of the refugees, first from Syria and then Jordan's West Bank, armed themselves and began making small raids into Israel. By 1950, the casualties were mounting. Jordan tried to stop the raids, but Israel blamed their neighbor and retaliated with overwhelming force. These reprisals culminated in October 1953, after a Palestinian killed an Israeli woman near the Green Line. Israel decided to seek revenge on the nearby Palestinian village of Kibbutz in the West Bank. No evidence linked the village to the crime. A large Israeli force attacked Kibbutz on the night of October 14. It was commanded by Ariel Sharon, future Prime Minister of Israel. Sharon later wrote, quote, the orders were utterly clear. Kibbutz was to be an example for everyone. The soldiers were ordered to achieve, quote, maximal killing and damage to property. For several hours, they rampaged, shooting villagers and dynamiting homes with their inhabitants still in them. By morning, 69 innocent men, women, and children were dead. One reporter compared it to Nazi reprisals during World War II. In spite of the massacre, raids increased over the next few years, mostly from Egypt-controlled Gaza. At the same time, a wave of anti-colonial nationalism swept through the Arab world, highlighting the Palestinian cause. So we could take a break now, and if you have any questions, so if we can turn the mics off for everybody except me. In 1952, Egyptian officers overthrew their corrupt king, and Gamal Abdel Nasser emerged as a dynamic nationalistic leader. He promised to help Egyptian farmers, to expel the British from the Suez Canal, and fight the Zionists in Palestine. He was also committed to uniting the Arab world. In Syria, the Ba'ath Party took power in 1954 and joined forces with the Communist Party. By this time, the Cold War was in full force, and the US and other Western governments feared that both countries would join the Soviet camp. In 1955, Israel executed 3 Israeli spies. The Israelis retaliated by invading Gaza and killing dozens of Egyptian soldiers. When the West refused to condemn the attack, Egypt began arming Palestinian Fedayeen, freedom fighters or people of sacrifice, and raids into Israel increased. So this was very much what Nasser preached. International tensions mounted as Nasser resisted American calls to join the Western anti-Soviet camp. When the US stopped funding the vital Aswan Dam project in July 1956, Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal. Over the next 2 months, Israel, France, and Britain secretly planned to invade Egypt. Each had their reasons. Britain was eager to regain control of the Suez Canal, and France wanted to punish Nasser for supporting the insurgency in the French colony of Algeria. Israel hoped to expand into the Sinai Peninsula, secure Israeli shipping in the Gulf of Aqaba, deal a military blow to Egypt, and end the raids from Gaza. Some Israelis also hoped that a war would trigger an exodus of Palestinians. In late October, Israel invaded the Gaza Strip and Sinai with air support from Britain and France. So here are some news headlines from that. And here's a map showing how they attacked right through the Sinai Peninsula. This war became known as the tripartite aggression or the Suez Crisis. However, the UN, the US, and the Soviets condemned the invasion, and 5 months later, Israel withdrew. So here we see, we're going to talk about the village of Kufr Qasim, and it's in central Israel. It's right on the green line between the West Bank and Israel. One Palestinian village paid a horrific price for this invasion. Kufr Qasim is just west of the Green Line in central Israel. Fearful that Jordan might attack Israel after the invasion of Egypt, on October 29th, Israel imposed a curfew on the Israeli border villages, including Kufr Qasim. The curfew was announced at 4:30 p.m., 30 minutes before it took effect. The villagers working in the fields were not warned, and that evening, Israeli soldiers massacred 49 of them in 1 hour as they returned home. The massacre shocked the 48 Palestinians. Israeli soldiers had slaughtered Israeli citizens inside the country, far from any hostilities, and it had been deliberate and planned at the highest levels. The Israeli Communist Party protested strongly, calling for an end to, quote, national oppression and aggression against peaceful Arab residents. The government tried to cover up the affair, but a trial revealed what happened and exposed some harrowing truths about the attitudes of Israeli soldiers towards 48 Palestinians. So one officer was asked, "Were you imbued with the feeling that the Arabs are the enemies of the state of Israel?" And he replied, "Yes." Quote, "Would you kill anyone, even a woman, a child?" "Yes," he reiterated. Another officer affirmed that had he been ordered to do so, he would have fired at a bus full of Arab women. And another explained, quote, "I was always told that every Arab was an enemy of the state in a fifth column." A few soldiers were imprisoned, and the commanding officer was fined less than $1. The massacre united the communists and Palestinian nationalists within Israel. In 1958, they established an Arab front. In the long term, the massacre played a part in forging the collective identity of the 48 Palestinians. Several decades later, Kufr Qasim began an annual commemoration each October 29th. So this is in the center of Kufr Qasim, and it has a list of all the people who were murdered there by the Israelis in 1956. And so in 2022, I was there on October 29th for the annual commemoration. So I took this photo and some others, so I'll just show you those. This is the center of town, and you can see the monument has the date 1956. And
وكل الأطفال لن ننساكم وسنظل نحيي ذكراكم حتى يرث الله الأرض ومن عليها لن ننساكم ولن
another one.
يا من ترقدون في جوار ربكم بسلام ستظل رائحة دماءكم تعطر هذه الأرض وسنبقى نحفظ حرمتها ما حيينا وننقل ذكراكم إلى الأجيال من بعدنا فإلى أرواح شهدائنا نقرأ سورة الفاتحة.
And so these people were attending, and they said it was okay to take their photo. You can see on the T-shirt it has 66, and that is because this was the 66th anniversary of the massacre. And so now, after all the speeches and everything, everybody walked up one of the main streets to the cemetery where all the victims are buried. And this is a cemetery. This is one of the victims. And this is another one. I don't read Arabic, but my understanding is that this is a young woman, Fatma, who was 15 years old. During the tripart aggression, Israel occupied the Gaza Strip for 5 months, hoping that the Palestinians would flee. However, they didn't, as they had learned from the Nakba that if they left their homes, they would never return. Israeli soldiers killed many Fedayeen in Gaza, but their self-sacrifice strengthened an emerging national Palestinian identity and a liberation movement. The Nakba had destroyed traditional Palestinian identity, but it was slowly being replaced by a new, radical form of nationalism forged in the shared experience of exile and the refugee camps and centered on the liberation of the homeland. By 1957, most Palestinian nationalists in exile were committed to an anti-imperialist struggle, pan-Arab unity, and driving the Zionists out of Palestine. They believed that the traditional Arab leaders were no friends of Palestine. They had betrayed and deserted the Palestinians in 1948, and they continued to serve their imperial masters. Nasser was the exception. His successful defiance of Israel and the West made him the hero of Arabs and many Palestinians who longed for radical change, both inside and outside Israel. In 1958, Egypt and Syria, both of which openly opposed Zionism and Western imperialism, merged to form the United Arab Republic. That same year, a military coup in Iraq transformed the country into a left-leaning republic. Amidst this upheaval, the Palestinian campaign to liberate their homeland became more popular in the Arab world. In 1959, a small group of young, educated Palestinian exiles of different ideological and intellectual backgrounds met in Kuwait and formed Al-Fatah, the first Palestinian-led national liberation movement. The founders included Yasser Arafat, an Egyptian-born Palestinian engineer. Arafat and his colleagues had first become politically active as students in Cairo, where they helped found the General Union of Palestinian Students. During the 1956 Israeli occupation of Gaza, Some had developed resistance skills and become leaders in the making. Al-Fatah, which means victory or to conquer in Arabic, differed from many other Fedayeen groups in three ways. First, the leaders were educated and had no connections to the traditional Palestinian elites. There were no bank accounts or land ownership to protect. Second, their members were young. And third, the movement lacked an ideology. It was not Muslim and it was not Marxist. Rather, it offered a big tent and encouraged nationalistic Palestinians to abandon party affiliations and join a Palestinian-led armed resistance movement. The basis of unity was simple. Palestine had to be liberated immediately, Israel had to be destroyed, and Jews who had arrived after World War I had to leave. That was it. Fatah's strategy also differed in that it would not depend on Arab governments that had been plagued by lethargy, diplomacy, and defeatism. Instead, Palestinians would take their destiny into their own hands and liberate their homeland themselves. Fatah's leaders also rejected Nasser's insistence that pan-Arab unity should come first, and then the liberation of Palestine. Instead, they adopted the slogan, quote, "The liberation of Palestine is the road to Arab unity." Fatah agreed with other Fedayeen groups that armed resistance was the only way to liberate their homeland. Imperialist and Zionist guns had defeated the Palestinians in 1936 and 1948, and now Palestinians had to take up arms to defeat imperialism and its allies. Israel had taught them the way. Israel says, "I am here by the sword." We must complete the saying, and only by the sword shall Israel be driven out. The organization drew strength from the revolutionary struggles in Algeria, Cuba, and Vietnam, which were proving that colonized peoples who were determined could triumph over foreign oppressors and colonizers. For the next few years, Fatah strengthened national unity, recruited supporters, and established clandestine cells throughout the Mideast. The movement remained underground except in Syria and Algeria, which welcomed the fighters with sanctuary and logistical support. This enabled Fatah to establish a military wing, Al-Asifa, the Storm. So a couple of images from the era. Many Palestinians hesitated to join Fatah, as they believed that Nasser would unite the Arabs and then liberate Palestine. However, two events changed much of this thinking. In 1961, the Egypt-Syria union collapsed, and Arab unity seemed in jeopardy. Nasser, preoccupied with domestic problems, abandoned plans to fight the Zionists. A year later, Algerian revolutionaries won their independence from France after a long, bloody campaign. These developments vindicated Fatah's claim that Arab unity was not necessary for liberation and that a self-reliant movement could succeed. As Fatah and other resistance groups grew more popular, Arab leaders began to worry. For all their declarations of support, most of them, including Nasser, feared a resistance movement that they could not control. In 1964, the leaders met and established the Palestine Liberation Organization, or PLO, a nominally Palestinian-led organization that called for the liberation of Palestine. Fatah refused to join, claiming that the PLO was insufficiently revolutionary and too closely linked to the Arab states. So these are some of the original leaders, founders of the PLO. And some posters from the era. At this point, we should pause, backtrack a few years, and look at the growth of the American Zionist movement and how it affected foreign policy. Beginning in 1924, America severely limited immigration from Eastern Europe, where most of the world's Jews were. This was due to widespread anti-Semitism, a fear of communist and fascist infiltrators, and anti-immigration sentiments. During the 1930s and 1940s, America refused Jewish refugees from Nazi Germany. American Zionists accepted this and focused on promoting Jewish settlement in Palestine. As knowledge of the Holocaust increased, some Americans demanded that America take in more refugees, but not the Zionists. Historian Ilan Pape explains, quote, "The principal message of American Zionists continued to be that the salvation of Jews lay in unlimited immigration into Palestine. This took precedence over rescuing Jews through any other means, even when other means were more viable." The 1942 Zionist Conference in New York energized American Zionists, and they formed a lobby group and reconnected with Christian Zionists, whose worldview was deeply rooted in Sunday school teachings. Pape observes, quote, "What they learned in Sunday school was enough to persuade them to follow Zionism blindly. The Jews were the chosen people who had to be protected unconditionally until return of the Messiah." The two groups eagerly united and were soon holding national conventions. The Zionists then began a campaign to Zionize America's Jews, and soon large Jewish organizations were converted. Pape observes that by 1948, quote, "there was barely any room for Jewish life outside the realm of Zionism." Meanwhile, Zionist lobbyists were winning politicians and shaping American public opinion. Politicians of both parties at every level were targeted. And by 1944, 80% of Congress endorsed Zionist demands. As well, 3,000 non-Jewish organizations were promoting the Zionist cause. So this is an ad for a newspaper ad for a mass rally, and you can see some of the names there, the speakers. You have Eleanor Roosevelt, the widow of President Roosevelt, the mayor of New York. Henry Morgenthau is very influential, and you've got Jaime Weizmann, who's one of the leaders of the whole Zionist movement. So it was a lot of high-level support for Zionism at the time. The Zionists also made inroads with university faculty members, trade unions, and the media. Mass rallies were a great success. In October 1946, a New York rally drew 250,000 people. By the time of the November 1947 UN vote on Resolution 181, the American government and publicly was solidly behind the Zionist cause. In several ways, the Truman administration set the tone for American foreign policy concerning Israel and the Palestinians. Domestic public support for Israel was a huge influence, and policymakers were attentive to those who, as Truman said, were, quote, anxious for the success of Zionism. In 1950, the Truman administration began ensuring that Israel enjoyed regional military superiority. And finally, American foreign policy consistently demonstrated an almost complete lack of concern about Palestinian national rights. In 1948, America watched, as Palestinian historian Rashid Halidi says, quote, as Israel and Jordan, quote, strangled the infant Palestinian state before it could be born. Subsequently, America never confronted Israel over the Palestinian refugee problem. After Eisenhower took office in 1953, American policy became more cautious and guided by Cold War priorities in an increasingly oil-dependent global economy. In the Mideast, America focused on developing and maintaining close relations with key governments, especially oil-producing states, and keeping them out of the Soviet camp. At times, the administration felt the Israeli lobby was working against America's interests and condemned Truman for having catered to, quote, the wishes of the Zionists in this country. In 1954, the lobbying organization American Israeli Public Affairs Committee, or AIPAC, was formed and tried to influence the midterm elections. Lobbyists boasted of having hundreds of candidates and 25 senators in their pockets. As one writer put it, quote, everyone in Congress quickly learned that AIPAC, backed by local councils and Zionist groups across the country, was monitoring their every move on Mideast policy. Even though Eisenhower felt pressured at times to support Israel, he confronted the Jewish state during the Suez Crisis. You can see Ben-Gurion spent a lot of time at the White House. John Kennedy took office in 1960, intent on continuing Eisenhower's policies. However, his closest advisors were active Jewish Zionists. While Kennedy admired Israel, he clashed with it over its clandestine nuclear program and the Palestinian refugee problem. Eventually, he agreed to forge a, quote, special relationship with Israel and sell it arms. So this is an excerpt from a speech. I'll just give you a minute to look at that. After Kennedy's assassination, President Johnson told a Zionist lobbyist, quote, you have lost a great friend, but you have found a better one. During his term, the U.S. became a wholehearted supporter of Israel. In a world dominated by Cold War politics, America increasingly saw Israel as a strategic asset in the Middle East. Slowly, Arab trust in America diminished. So back to our story. By late 1964, Fatah had built a guerrilla organization and was ready to launch its first raid into Israel from Lebanon. It was scheduled for January 1st, 1965, but the Lebanese arrested the Fedayeen. However, Fatah declared it a great success, and in time, January 1st became Fatah Day, a celebration of the beginning of the modern-day Palestinian armed struggle. Subsequent guerrilla raids were modest, but they achieved secondary goals. First, Fatah gained much-needed prestige. At least it was doing something, unlike the Nasser-backed groups. Second, the attacks reminded the Israelis that the supposedly non-existent Palestinians were alive. And finally, each raid inspired 10 or more Palestinian men to join Fatah's ranks. The more than 1 million refugees provided a steady stream of recruits. Egypt, Lebanon, and Jordan closed their frontiers to Fatah's Fedayeen. Not only did they fear massive Israeli retaliation and a possible war, they knew that if Fatah's popular struggle succeeded, it might sweep away not only Zionism, but imperialism and its allies, them included. The only exception was the left-wing militantly anti-Israel government of Syria. During the next 2 years, the number and sizes of raids increased, and Israel's cross-border reprisals intensified. The largest reprisal in 10 years took place in November 1966 after a mine killed 3 Israeli soldiers near the border with the Jordanian West Bank. Even though Jordan cooperated with Israel and no evidence linked villages to the Fedayeen, Israel decided to attack the nearby West Bank village of Samu, near Hebron. During the assault, hundreds of Israeli soldiers destroyed about 150 homes, a school, and a clinic. The UN Security Council condemned the attack, but Israel ignored it. Many historians see this reprisal as having significantly contributed to the war that was looming. So it's another image from the attack on Samu in the South Hebron Hills. The Six-Day War of June 1967 radically transformed the political landscape of Israel and much of the Middle East, and profoundly affected the lives of millions of Palestinians. Israeli propaganda again successfully portrayed itself to the Western world as a victim. The powerful, savage Arab Goliaths were massed and ready to attack the small David and drive the Jews into the sea. Israel launched a preemptive attack to defend itself, and against all odds won miraculous victories. But again, the truth was much different. The attack was not preemptive, and Israel was not defending itself. Menahem Begin later said, quote, "We must be honest. We decided to attack Nasser." Israeli General Ezer Weizmann stated that the war was a continuation of the 1948 war and the 1956 invasion of Egypt, and that Israel had been planning for it. With increasing American arms shipments, Israel was confident it could win a war with its neighbors, and it was eager for a fight. Israel wanted a war for several reasons. First, to end the Fedayeen attacks. Second, to teach Nasser a lesson. Many feared his ability to unite the Arabs and turn them into a fighting nation. 3, to stimulate the sluggish Israeli economy. And 4, to grow more land. Israel coveted the Sinai Peninsula and the fertile Golan Heights. As well, it could capture the West Bank. Many Israeli leaders regretted not having done that in 1948. But here we can see the Golan Heights, which were Syrian territory up in the north. And that's the blue is Lake Tiberias or the Sea of Galilee. And so these are highlands overlooking the Galilee. So they were strategically important. In late 1966, Israel began inciting Syrian forces in the Golan Heights and threatening war. Egypt and Syria signed a defense treaty, but the Israeli provocations continued. Nasser did not want a war, but he had to do something. His prestige in the Arab world was on the line. He signed a defense pact with Jordan and then secretly appealed to the Americans to reduce tensions. But they had already sided with the Israelis. As the Americans saw it, an Israeli offensive would destroy Egypt militarily, discredit Nasser, and lessen Soviet influence in the region. All desirable outcomes. Early June 5th, the Israeli Air Force attacked Egypt, destroying its air force on the ground. A lightning invasion of the Sinai Peninsula and Gaza followed. At the same time, Israeli forces conquered East Jerusalem and drove the Jordanian army out of the West Bank. They then attacked the Syrian-occupied Golan Heights, where they expelled 35,000 people. On June 11th, a ceasefire was signed. In 6 days, Israel had destroyed 3 Arab armies, tripled its territory, and assumed control of more than 1 million Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza. So these are some Israeli tanks. And some Egyptians surrendering. And some more surrendering. And some more. And this headline more or less represents the reality. So that's all I have for today. And next week, we'll see the repercussions of the war and how that changed things.